All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toby Szustak, and I currently work as the American Academy of Diplomacy's Spring 2023 virtual intern. I am a sophomore currently attending Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, pursuing a Bachelor's of Arts in Economics and Global Studies. And today we have a panel called Diplomacy in Crisis. This panel will focus on what working in or directing an embassy is like during times of heightened political tension. This panel serves as an entertaining yet informational panel for those aspiring to join the Foreign Service, those interested in international affairs, and those who want to know more about the Department of State. And trust me, with these panelists, I am sure it will be nothing short of entertaining. The moderator for this panel is Ambassador Ronald Neumann. Although he may not need an introduction for most here today, Ambassador Neumann is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and both a career diplomat and former ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. The first panelist we have with us is Ambassador John Tefft. Ambassador Tefft served as ambassador to Russia, Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine. Most notably, Ambassador Tefft oversaw the embassy in Georgia during the invasion from Russia in 2008. The second panelist is Ambassador Susan Page. Ambassador Page has served in multiple posts as well, most notably as political advisor to the IGAD Secretariat for Peace in Sudan, where she helped in the negotiation process to the end of Africa's longest civil war. She also served as ambassador to the Republic of South Sudan and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. The third and final panelist we have joining us is Ambassador James Jeffrey. Ambassador Jeffrey was Deputy Chief of Mission during the evacuation of Kuwait and served as ambassador to Turkey, Albania, and Iraq. I will now hand it over to the moderator of the discussion, Ambassador Neumann, to tell everyone a little bit more about what the American Academy of Diplomacy is and what it does, and to start off our panel today.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you all my colleagues for joining me, and for those of you out there in the audience who I hope will enjoy the program. Just a brief commercial introduction on the American Academy of Diplomacy. It's a small organization of former senior diplomatic practitioners, not all career, mixture of political appointees, foreign service officers, aid, mission directors, but all people who've worked at a senior level with foreigners to try to advance U.S. diplomacy. It's about 40 years old. It was begun by people like Henry Kissinger and Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker. It is an organization that both tries to talk to Americans about what diplomacy is, why it's important, and it tries to talk to the State Department about things that we think it could do better. And then it tries to tell the Congress about how it should change some legislation to help the State Department do things better, whether it wants to or not. And so this all keeps us busy. We're a small organization. One of our programs with our interns, it has been to have each intern do some form of program during their internship. Toby has picked this interesting melange of crisis personalities to take a look at. It's a new idea that he came up with and developed with a little help from Katie Aselby, our administrative assistant, and Maria Ricehouse. But it's very much Toby's idea. So thank you, Toby, for coming up with it and for the selection of panelists. And with that, I think we can get into the discussion. Now, we have an embarrassment of riches in our panelists, which is to say, each of them has had more than one crisis, been in bizarre, if not dangerous situations more than once. And the result is they could talk each one longer than the whole forum program. So basically, as we go through a number of questions about how do you manage an embassy and how do you manage policy and how do you manage upward, sometimes to the level of the president, I wanted to ask each of them to start with just a minute or so about which crisis you're going to draw most of your examples from, so people have a little bit of context. And perhaps while you're at it, any reflections on what makes leading in a crisis different from leading all the rest of the time? And we can I think we'll just kind of go down the way we started, but then we'll probably reverse coming back. So, John, why don't you start off?
Thanks very much, Ron. I'm glad to be here with everybody. Thanks, Toby, for putting this together, and Katie. I think as I look back on my career, my first time of dealing with war was as a junior officer in Jerusalem from 72 to 74 during the October 73 war. I was there, and while there was no fighting per se in Jerusalem, it was a pretty tense and difficult situation. And I looked at it, my first post in the Foreign Service, with kind of amazement and fear and just trying to understand and take it all in. But in terms of crises, as Toby mentioned, probably the most difficult time I had was, or the most challenging time was when I was ambassador to Georgia in August of 2008, when the Russo-Georgian War took place. My friend Jim Jeffrey was actually Deputy National Security Advisor in those days, and it was somebody that I actually worked with and in a way reported to keep everybody, our political leaders, briefed. It was really a tense time. We never had fighting in Tbilisi, but we didn't know that. It was a crisis that had been brewing for months, and then it blew up overnight, and with a lot of people eventually killed and displaced. Trying to both relate to the government, to keep Washington informed, as well as to maintain the morale and allay the fears of my staff. And among those, I include not just the American staff and spouses and families who offered the opportunity to go to Yerevan. Masha Jovanovic was ambassador there, and she and her staff did a wonderful job of putting up those members of the families who wanted to leave Tbilisi to go down to the Yerevan without having to go back all the way to the States. But then also dealing, as I say, with our locally employed staff. And that was, if I had to cite one big difference between day-to-day leadership and crisis, it was dealing with these people, because many of our wonderful Georgian employees had husbands, spouses, brothers, fighting on the front lines. People died. They were worried, they didn't hear from them. And trying to maintain morale and to try to keep everybody functioning over what was really a month-long, really hard work, not a lot of sleep, trying to keep focused was one of the biggest challenges of that period that was different from day-to-day leadership. Maybe I'll stop at that point.
Thanks. I'm going to go on to Jim, I think he's been competing, or we've been competing for years about who got shot at most. But anyway, Jim, pick your crisis of choice.
Neumann wins, but I was placed on alert in the 3rd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division in the Yom Kippur War to go in and rescue John Tefft and the rest of Israel, but fortunately didn't have to deploy. Where I did deploy, and what I'll talk about today, is the fight against the Islamic State from 2014 to present, actually, where the United States, in comparison to much of what we've done in the Middle East, got everything right on the ground specifically. We had the right local allies, particularly in Iraq and Syria, and I'll focus on Syria. We had a multilateral coalition. We used just the right amount of military power combined with diplomatic finesse, and we were very successful in destroying the Islamic State, this vicious, literally state with 1.9 million people in Iraq almost totally, and in northern Syria where we operate. It's still around in the rest of Syria under Assad's control. But that's not what I'm really going to talk about directly. Rather, the complications that came when we tried to embed this highly successful, full of good lessons learned operation inside the extremely complicated Syrian conflict that's been raging from 2011 till now. And specifically that in Syria, we chose as our partner the Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish group that was an offshoot of the Turkish PKK, which is a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization on our and everybody else's terrorist list, that was anathema to Turkey. And this led to extraordinary problems between the United States and Turkey, reflecting problems in military civilian operations, problems within the State Department, and problems internationally. I was the Syria envoy and simultaneously, for most of the time, the representative to the coalition to defeat the Islamic State. So I was given the portfolio to deal with all of this, and I'll talk about it in a second.
Susan, on to you.
Okay, well, thank you also for having me, and great job, Toby, in organizing us. I will speak mostly about my experience in South Sudan when I was ambassador and the war broke out in December of 2013. So just under 3 years of South Sudan's independence from Sudan, and how difficult it was making sure that everyone was okay. Chaos back in Washington over whether or not we should completely evacuate and close the mission, whether we should stay open, what would that mean if we did close altogether, and essentially trying to figure out what was our interest in South Sudan after things had broken out, whether or not it made sense. In other words, asking sort of the fundamental questions: why do we have embassies where we do? Not whether or not we should have relations with countries, but whether or not those resources should be spent in a particular location, especially when there is a crisis or war. Having to mount an evacuation when the airport was closed, and when there was a real schism in the government. So I'll talk about that, and I'll talk a little bit, I'll just reflect briefly on the time that when I was posted to Nairobi, Kenya, I was a regional legal advisor actually for USAID, and I covered Burundi and Rwanda when the genocide broke out, and the presidents of both Rwanda and Burundi were killed, and how we reacted as an embassy in Kenya with the neighboring embassies to get people to safety. And it was the age when CNN broadcasting all 24-hour news cycle had just begun. So watching the people crossing, streaming out of Rwanda was, just one of those things that was a first, that you could see it real time live. Thank you.
Susan, I'm just going to ask you to continue with the theme that you've raised, and then I'm going to ask our colleagues to play back. And this goes into this business of how do you manage policy? You've got to manage sidewise with the government you're working with abroad. You have to manage downward to keep your team intact, but keep them on the, for now we're talking policy, keep them on message. And you have to manage upward, which can often be bizarre. We just before the program, we were talking about somebody criticizing this new show, The Diplomat, about, well, you wouldn't be on the phone with the president this way necessarily, or the secretary. And I was reflecting that I once had a secure phone conversation with a national security advisor to discuss whether the president would sit at the lunch with President Karzai. Because nobody below him could agree to this, and not doing it would have been a great insult and been difficult for our relations. And I think we've all had issues. So just carry on for a minute about how do you manage up, down, and sideways on policy?
Sure. Well, I would say it obviously really does depend. I would say that in my situation, there were a lot of people in Washington who believed that they were real experts on South Sudan. And I see some of you laughing. That makes me happy. Because I think one of the first things that most of us realize, regardless of our position, is just how little we actually do know. And the fact that these people who, really did think that they knew everything, but they were spending a lot of time on truly inconsequential matters, when decisions that needed to be made quickly. And that was kind of like all of the messages that we were sending, both calls and cables, that the situation is deteriorating, things are getting worse. But Washington was focused on having a high-level sort of investment conference that the South Sudanese wanted to hold, and flying people out and supporting that, when literally a week later, the war actually broke out. And we were trying at the embassy to say, I don't think this is a great time, but you know, this investment conference just had to go forward. We had people, when we were actually doing the evacuation, we've got CJTF HOA, the military.
That's a joint task force of the military.
Yes. So based in Djibouti, so it's the AFRICOM's central location in Africa, and they were responsible for our safety and evacuating those who were going to be evacuated. And we had people in the National Security Council asking us, well, we need to make sure we understand exactly how many people can get on each one C-130 and how many seats there are going to be. Like the military knows all of that. That's not what, you know, other people need to be thinking about. So sometimes it was just the trivial that you had to kind of block out the white noise and just get on with business. In my case, I need to deal directly with the commander at CJTF HOA in Djibouti, who was also, of course, we were all communicating directly with the commander in Germany. So sometimes you just have to block out the noise to make decisions that you know are best on the ground. And, you know, as the saying goes, ask for forgiveness later.
John, I think you alluded at one point to having a somewhat more cooperative relationship with your superior in the NSC.
I was actually pretty lucky, Ron, as I look back on this, because it was a slow brewing crisis, which kind of blew up in August. But for most of 2008, everyone from the President of the United States, George Bush, on down had been following this, because the Russians steadily increased the pressure before they finally invaded. But President Saakashvili had been to Washington and had lunch and meetings with President Bush and with Vice President Cheney. Secretary Rice had been twice out to visit Tbilisi, and Steve Hadley was very much up on it, partly because Jim Jeffrey and Damon Wilson were his key guys to follow the crisis day to day. And then my friend Dan Freed and the deputy assistant was assistant secretary for Europe, and Matt Bryza was the deputy assistant secretary. So I had a group of people back there who understood the issues, and my job, my staff's job, was to try to get the information in and to try to follow it, because it wasn't totally clear to us. We didn't have very good intelligence because most of the focus was on Afghanistan and Iraq at that point, so that we had to do as much as we could reporting from our contacts with the Georgian government. Now, we also had in Moscow in these days Bill Burns and John Byerly. So it was really a group of professionals, people who were not just people I admired, but people who were friends, who were able to kind of see this through and to try to work the issues, as it were. So it was really a question of them. If I didn't brief them, they'd be reaching out to me for information, which I know doesn't always exist in crisis situations that foreign service officers find themselves in. So I considered myself pretty lucky. The hardest part was trying to figure out what was actually going to happen and what the intentions, particularly of the Russians, were going to be as they invaded with up to 80,000 troops, which they had kept after they'd kept on the northern part of the Caucasus in North Ossetia, even after their summer exercises had finished. It was one of the clear signs that they were getting ready to make a move one way or the other, even if that hadn't happened in August. So it was a question of me, particularly, I think we had one cable, and I can speak about this because it was briefed to Ron Asmus in his book, a little war that shook the world. If anybody hasn't read it and wants to read a tremendous book about what happened then and the implications, not always friendly toward the Bush administration, but it's a tremendous piece of work that is authoritatively briefed. We sent in a cable basically after the first day of fighting and said, this looks bad. Everything that the US over multiple administrations has done is now in the balance. And we need to react. President Bush had made it clear we weren't sending American soldiers in there, but we ended up bringing in humanitarian flights as well as bringing back Georgian soldiers who were down in Iraq, participating in the work that we did down there, and then heavily getting engaged with the Russians to try to get them to stop the fighting. Eventually, President Sarkozy of France negotiated on behalf of the EU. Secretary Rice cleaned up a couple of pieces that were not nailed down, and we got to a ceasefire, which I'll conclude by saying the Russians have still not adhered to today, however many years now it is after they signed their names to the documents in 2008.
Jim, you've had this unique perspective on this group of having been sort of involved in policy management from Washington looking out, and from the field in a variety of perspectives, trying to handle Washington and manage policy upward. You want to reflect on anything out of that particular room?
Yeah, and it was more policy was managed too well from the field and wasn't managed enough in Washington. That's my shtick on today, because I know what the focus will be. We had such a successful operation, particularly in northeast Syria against the Islamic State, and our high-end special forces groups, they are known as the task force, and their state counterparts risking their lives with the Kurdish SDF, were having great success. The problem is, and I was involved in the decision-making at the beginning on the Defense Policy Board, that we went in 2014 with the understanding that this would be very problematic for the Turks. So we had to balance everything we did, Turkish interests, given how difficult, but also, as we've seen in Ukraine, how critical they are, and our needs in the field against the Islamic State with our battle buddies. And the short answer is we didn't get this right. This led to 2 emergency trips to Ankara by first Vice President Biden in 2016, then Vice President Pence in 2019, and 2 decisions, most dramatically by President Trump, to pull our troops out. Now they're still there, but that required extraordinary diplomatic efforts on the part of everybody, particularly the Secretary, then Mike Pompeo, to try to fix this. And the fact that we had to fix something that should have been one of our gold star operations is an indication that you have to get this right. And the danger isn't just with bad partners, of which we've had many experiences, or failing operations, and we've had a lot of those. But when something is going right, it is very hard to rein in guys and girls in the field who are doing the right thing from their perspective. These people we had in Syria weren't responsible for U.S.-Turkey relations. That was the responsibility of another bureau, the European Bureau. That was the responsibility of another military command, EUCOM. So they were just charging ahead. Now, I was put in to try to pull all of this together, having had 4 tours in Turkey, and I, to some degree, failed too. And the reason is, first of all, any operation that is going well in the field, particularly one that 2 presidents were very proud of, fighting terrorists and Al-Qaeda offshoot, is very, very hard to control from Washington if you have, if you will, collateral diplomatic damage. Secondly, your partners are important. In the larger scheme of things, Turkey is far more important than the SDF in northeast Syria. In terms of how we relate, if we like the people, and there's a little bit of this with John in Georgia, if we like the people we're working with, if they're our kind of people, or at least they sound like our kind of people, and Ron and I have seen this in Iraq with some of our friends in 2004 as well, we tend to over-sympathize and over-commit. And if an ally is extremely difficult, today I'm not talking about Macron, I'm talking about an even more difficult one, Erdogan, we tend to play down and not do the right thing. Macron didn't get the call about the Australian submarines. That's bad news. Well, Erdogan didn't get a whole lot of things we committed to him on Northeast Syria operations. And even more than Macron, he reacted by sending troops in. And that's how serious this stuff can get.
It is playing with fire. I'm going to circle back around, but Jim, I'm just going to keep going with you for a minute, though. You know, any ambassadorship involves leading your mission, keeping morale up, keeping people safe. But when things get difficult, when people are afraid of being killed, things change. Then they change sometimes depending on who the people are. I know when I first went to Algeria, I had a mission of a lot of people who had not volunteered to be in a place where there was a blanket death threat to foreigners. And after, with rotation, some of them left, and you had people who had expected to have that be in that kind of circumstance. It was a little bit different, easier to manage. But when I go back around the group, Jim, just continuing with you, looking downward, looking at managing your own teams. What's different about leadership in a crisis from the day-to-day leadership?
Well, my team were the people in Syria, the state people, who thought I was totally wrong and that I should devote 100% of my decision-making to supporting them and their partners rather than trying to split it as best we could between Turkey and the SDF. So my first problem was convincing them that I was on their side up to a very significant point. And the first thing that requires is you have to spend a lot of time in the field. And if it's in a dangerous or uncertain situation, you have to be out there with them. At one point, we were ordered to evacuate, and the word came down for me to hop on a plane that I'd flown in on. And I said, I can't leave until the last American leaves. That's the kind of thing you got to do. And it's the kind of thing that later Bill Roebuck did a year later when we had yet another Turkish incursion and got the award for heroism for it. Deservedly so, because leadership has to be present and visible in any emergency situation. The other thing is you have to make clear to everybody, no matter how junior, what the policy is. They're all out there doing their best, risking their lives in some cases, and they need to know why you do what you do. And frankly, I had nothing but support on some very difficult decisions and very difficult operations with these people, whether they thought that the overall policy was good or, as most of them did most of the time, really terrible. But they executed because they felt that Washington at least listened to them, and we gave them their day in court, even when the court ruled against them. But it wasn't easy.
John?
I think I'd mention a couple of things, Ron. I mentioned before the importance of the FSNs, the locally employed staff. At the first day of the war, basically invited everybody who wanted to come to outside the ambassador's office. We had a big lobby, and I invited all of the staff to come, and I just told them basically what I knew of what was going on. And I discovered afterwards, I did this every day, and through the weekend, and because we were all working overtime. And I later, some of both the American and the Georgian staff came to me and said, you do not know how important that was, both as a way of keeping informed of what was going on, but also a sense of, you cared about us and our families and the rest of it. And it was I didn't make a big rah-rah kind of point out of it, but it was that communication was critical. Another key thing for me was I had a great DCM, Kent Logsdon, who's now our ambassador in Moldova. And when it was very clear, it was very chaotic on the battlefield, we decided that we did not want to ask for ordered departure, have everybody to go back to Washington, because we'd had friends who, you get everybody back there, and then it gets to be really hard bureaucratically for everybody to say, okay, now it's time, you can go back. So we worked out this arrangement, and we literally worked it on the phone with Pat Kennedy, our Undersecretary for Management, to do what had been done in Hungary earlier in the year when the mob attacked the American embassy, and they moved the families, those who wanted to go up to Budapest for a few weeks. And we basically replicated that with having people move to Armenia. The other thing I think I would mention is we wanted really hard to keep Washington informed, obviously, and they were constantly asking us for more information. But I also didn't want my staff out on the battlefield. We're talking 50 miles from Tbilisi is where the fighting was taking place. I didn't want guys out there, no matter how experienced they were, defense attaches or others, to either get caught in something or to find themselves focused on by the Russian media, which was on the battlefield. And then we would have stories, Americans are fighting or Americans are doing something for the Georgians. You had to kind of constantly be aware of things like that and make sure that that what we wanted to do, the rules of the game within the US government, were understood by everybody and that nobody was out there freelancing and taking risks. Then we also, the last point would be our consular section did a tremendous job. It wasn't the kind of thing we're seeing today in Sudan where people are evacuating under fire, but we got we had, I think, 12 buses with embassy staff, but also a lot of Americans who were private citizens who we also took down to Armenia and put them up there. Keeping the open and keeping those people assured of what we were trying to do was really a critical part as well.
Susan, reflections on keeping your staff together, informed, controlling rumors, managing the larger American community around you when you can't always do high policy.
Yeah, we had a really incredible team, and I agree with everything that has been said, with especially what John said about communications. We were already a very small team, and we did not have families. It's an unaccompanied assignment, 1-year assignments for most people, although possibility to extend. I actually had to work hard to even get the DCM post to be a 2-year position instead of just a 1-year position. So I actually had 3 DCMs during my time as ambassador, 1 each year. And that's tough, but because we were so small and we all lived on one compound with one exception, but so it was easy. We actually knew each other. We had already developed these kinds of relations. People cooked together. And even when we started the Emergency Action Committee meetings, people would bring what they had and bring it to my home. I mean, it was hardly, the typical ambassador's residence, but such as it was. And that became our communications hub. And so it was, we played wiffle ball together. We had a wiffle ball team. And when it finally came time to really draw down, and we have to remember that at that time, it was less than 9 months since our ambassador had been killed in Libya, and our colleagues with him. And so understandably, although I complain a little bit about Washington getting mired in details that they didn't really need to worry about, this could have been another stain. And so they were understandably risk averse after having just lost Chris Stevens. So, but by the time it came to actual evacuation, people didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay. They wanted to help. They felt as if their presence would be or could be useful, not just to me, but to the people of South Sudan. And that was an incredible feeling, is that in the course of that time, they had developed these kinds of feelings and relationships with our staff, with the local population. But I did the same thing, just regularly communicating with people, because honestly, half of the Emergency Action Committee was the staff. I mean, it was our team. There weren't a lot of people who were left out because there wasn't a deep bench. And the consular team. The other thing I would say, one of the things that I did is I went out to the airport with each of our flights that went out and boarded those planes and said a few words to the people getting on them. And they were not only Americans, they were lots of other diplomats, lots of other citizens from other countries. And I've been told that that was, they really appreciated those words of comfort that I gave them. And also the fact that our consular team and I personally reached out to folks to say, we have another flight that's going to be going. And if you've got people still there, we were calling people and helping people make it to the airport. So I think those kinds of communication tips and keeping the morale up, understanding the situation goes a really long way.
We need to move to audience questions, but I just want to take one more minute to go back around with one final opening. All of you have stressed in one way or another, really the devotion of our people and our teams to getting the job done, not running off at the first crack of danger. Although that does seem to have changed, and not in the field, but in Washington lately. We left Kyiv, totally pulled out all our embassy people. We were not the first to go back in. I think we followed the Italians, some others that I wouldn't necessarily have expected to be the path breakers. We pulled out all our people in Khartoum, ahead of other Americans. Let me just leave it open. Do you, granted, none of us were in any of those places, but any views or comments for just a minute or two as we sweep back around?
If I could start, I would just say, having lived in Sudan and in Khartoum, and knowing the kinds of threats, it is difficult to understand what people were going through, but there were some very real threats against not only Americans, but the convoy that was attacked, the American convoy. And we have lost diplomats in Khartoum before. Literally the day that I left Sudan, back in 2007, New Year's Eve, I land on the ground and in Washington and find out one of our diplomats has been killed. So it's understandable. I know some of the people that were still there, the Norwegian ambassador and everyone. It's difficult when you really are under threat. Our embassy in Juba, when we were evacuating, the communications from the president was that we know that Vice President Riek Machar is hiding at the American embassy compound. So he put a big target on our backs as well, and framed everything in that context. So it just made it much more difficult to operate, and that meant that I had to have a close protection team for a lot longer than probably would have been necessary, but I did stay. So I hope that they will set up nearby and not be out for long, but it's really bad what's happening in Sudan.
It's terrible. I got my own feelings though. If you're organizing a convoy of Americans, it bothers me not to have a diplomatic personnel leading that, saying you're on. Come on, John, over to you.
As LBJ and Tefft are Jimmy Carter in '79, or President Reagan in 1983, or Barack Obama in 2012 can say, you lose a diplomatic establishment to the enemy or almost lose it, you're in deep doo-doo. So it's our job, not only to our own people and the many people who depend upon us, including FSNs, to keep these things secure and if necessary, close them. But I make a huge difference between that security concern and sending people in small penny packages out to do critical mission work. That means getting outside the embassy. That means traveling out and taking risks. We've got people, and I've seen hundreds of them, thousands of them, who are willing to do it. We do it as safely as possible. Occasionally we lose people, but we need to keep doing it. And the same applies to, again, the Roebuck case. You can have a mission of one ambassador and a satellite telephone, and you're still on the ground, you're still working with the US military as long as they're on the ground, and you're still working with our local partners. That's crucially important, and we can do it. In the case, frankly, the Secretary of State had to overrule DS and say Roebuck would stay on as long as the task force had any troops there, and that was the right decision.
John, you get another word here, and then we'll go to questions.
I'd just add one thing. The question of making sure that everybody was safe was kind of a day-to-day thing. And the toughest moment I had was after the Russians broke through the Georgian lines and started coming down the road from Gori, which is in the center of Georgia, toward Tbilisi. And we had CNN teams out there literally filming this as it's going along so that Jim Jeffrey could watch it in Washington on TV, and we're watching it on TV. And then not knowing for sure whether the Russians would actually come into Tbilisi or not. But as the ambassador, I knew that our embassy was literally 1 block off the road, or 2 blocks off the road, which the Russians would use to enter into Tbilisi. So I didn't have shooting and the kinds of things that others have had to deal with around the embassy, but I had to make a choice. Do I try to move people back into the embassy? Do I move people to let them stay at home? You know, it seems like a small decision at the time, but it could have been a life and death decision. And we basically told people to stay at home. And in the end, the Russians stopped. And then within a few days, the ceasefire starts going into effect. But it was a pretty tense evening. Saakashvili and his team were getting ready to evacuate the presidential palace because I was down there for a while that evening. So it was one of those moments where you just don't know the answer. As I say, we talked to Pat Kennedy, who was tremendous in helping us understand what the right thing to do was. And then in the end, it's the ambassador's decision. And those are the lonely moments that others, I'm sure, have had much tougher ones than I had, but those are the ones that are the hardest.
I could keep asking you all questions for a long time, but we're going to run out of time. So, Toby, you have some kind of questions there you want to field to us?
Yes. So I have a few questions from the Google form that was filled out. Let me pull that up really quick. So the first one is, how will U.S. diplomacy work when the Taliban were unfaithful in implementing the Doha deal commitments, such as assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri and women rights violations? What are other possibilities and ways that the U.S. may reclaim its trust from people of Afghanistan?
This is going to take us a long way off our central focus here. Frankly, right now, I'm going to say a couple of words as a former ambassador in Afghanistan who kept going back, but right now we have very, very little we can do. We're not going to go back in militarily. There are real limitations to what can be done from over the horizon. The Taliban is not showing any particular interest in making any huge concessions on the things that are important to us, like women's rights, in order to get recognition. So it's going to be a long, grinding process, but it is important to maintain some form of contact, because when you lose contact, then you have to get over all kinds of political barriers domestically in order to be able to resume contact. But there's very little, frankly, we're going to do. And right now, yes, people are blaming us. In fact, if we end up cutting off humanitarian aid because women can't work, we may well be blamed more than the Taliban. What I'm seeing in opinion surveys is Afghans by and large are saying, well, it's your fault. You know, you didn't have to leave. But let's go on. Let's see if we got a question that's a little more focused centrally on our panel.
Absolutely. We have Bob who's raising his hand to ask a question right now. So we'll go to him and then I'll ask it.
Okay, I have full disclosure. Bob is our other intern, but we'll give him a crack anyway. Yep. Somebody's.
Thank you. I was trying to unmute, sorry. But thank you for allowing me to ask a question. So overall, this is a great panel. I did have a question about mental health and during these crises. So I know you within an embassy, you have a country team, and also you have to interact with your country team. How do you go about like ensuring that everybody's mental health is like how do you have like take care of people's mental health and also your own mental health during these crises?
Imagine everybody's got their answers. General Casey used to tell his staff in Iraq that everybody needs to get rest, exercise, and time for reading. I know of nobody who managed all three. Susan, you go ahead, or who would like to?
Just very briefly, I would say that when crises persist for a long time and you're operating under a long period of sustained stress where operations are kind of limited, it doesn't mean people aren't going out and doing their job, but under kind of a fog of threat. It's important that people check in with each other. One tip that I learned later when I was chargé into the AU was that as an ambassador, to put on your calendar appointments that I had. So it could be a workout that from 3 to 4 or whatever time, workout, gym, an appointment for, the doctor. We do, as a small embassy, and Africa, generally speaking, does not have the same resources as the countries that we've been talking about, the other countries that are the focus today. But the regional psychiatrist would come out, the regional medical officer would come out. In the case of South Sudan, limited other outside resources in that sense. But people really did look after each other. And again, I think that's some of the beauty of being in a smaller place. But there were times when, staff would come to me and I wouldn't necessarily know because they don't want to demonstrate something to the ambassador. But I would need to go in and talk to someone and get them the help that they needed. So sometimes you have to step up and play the leadership role. But in most of the cases, it's not Washington that's usually very helpful, but your fellow, your fellow people at the post that you're in.
Yeah, super true.
I would add, I think Susan's right. When things are really tense, you really got to rely on everybody taking care of each other. Now, as the ambassador, you can make that clear that you expect everybody, whether it's not just section by section, but you expect everybody to try to take care of each other. And if somebody's got an issue to deal with it. I was fortunate in Georgia because our nurse practitioner who we had at post was actually a retired Army Special Forces officer who was particularly good at being able to take people aside and say, I can deal with that. I can understand what you're going through. Not that he became the regional psychiatrist, it wasn't, but he was particularly helpful at trying to help get us through that difficult time.
Yeah, I know in Afghanistan, I used to conspicuously stay home on our one weekend day and then play volleyball with the Marines. So it was very clear that I wasn't going in the embassy, and I wanted other people at least not to feel they needed to be in the embassy. Small stuff matters. Toby got another Jim doesn't look like he's jumping in, so we'll let Toby ask us another question.
All right, so the next question I have is, what is the single most important thing any diplomat can do to prepare for a crisis?
The single most important thing you can do, Jim.
Know the mission and know who to go to in Washington and in the host country to get answers and to get action. You got 70% of the way to success right there.
What about preparing yourself?
You can't prepare. I mean, you can go to the gym, you can, the only way to prepare for these things is to go through them, frankly.
Yeah. John or Susan, you want to jump on that one too? How do you prepare?
I think the thing that I had the best luck with was I made it abundantly clear to everybody on the staff, the employees, that they were to take the emergency action plan, or whatever we call them now, and take this seriously, because at a lot of posts, especially ones where you don't have an immediate threat of kind of violence or a threat to individuals, people just will tend to look at this as just another bureaucratic exercise. Now, I suspect that Afghanistan and Iraq and those areas, it's a different story, but we knew that there was always a chance of something happening in Georgia. But I made sure from the ambassador down that people took the exercise of preparing, and this kind of goes to Jim's point, that they understood their role in what an emergency evacuation or an emergency situation at the embassy was, and that they took it seriously. And I think that's something that a lot of post ambassadors have to be pretty firm on.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think it helps if you have a real sense of all of the things that Jim talked about, but the potentials. What are the potential threats and likelihoods, and therefore what in the EAP are we most likely to possibly see in the emergency action plan in reality? If you're in a Haiti, well, it's in an area where they're constantly having temperature, climate change issues, eruptions, etc. So we knew that we were in situations that were highly volatile, or they would have sent us with our families. So we didn't have that. That you're already at a heightened threat. The other thing is, the parts that you can't prepare for is that sometimes we find people really step up in crisis situations, that when it's just ordinary times, maybe my opinion was, this person is not all that, dedicated or committed, but boy, did they step up in the moment they were really needed. And that's something that people learn about themselves too, is how to lead in a crisis. So knowing who to talk to, who to go to, and that you need to reach out very quickly before things escalate to a point that you as the ambassador maybe lose control of even the situation or the narrative.
We have a question in the chat, which I'm going to condense, but I'm not sure whether this panel has the right people to answer it, because it's basically a question that boils down to whether the sort of newer generation of diplomats, having grown up maybe in a different realm and more computer immersed, have the emotional character skills to deal with a time of crisis in the same way that we did as younger people or people before us did. I don't know whether any of us are managing embassies right now. My impression, meeting new people, is they certainly do, but any thoughts on that one?
I've been retired now for a few years, so I'm not current in that sense, but I have friends in the department, and I know other officers who work for me who are coming to senior positions now. And I get the impression that people join the Foreign Service these days, and they understand that in some ways this is still a very dangerous profession, and that you have to go into this with your eyes open, You have to understand the implications for yourself, for your spouse, for your kids, whether it's unaccompanied posts, danger posts, or places that could blow up and instantly become a crisis. I get the sense that a lot of the people we have really do understand this, and that, you know, without having a scientific poll, they have the same sense of commitment and service and emotional buy-in that all of us had in our generation.
I agree fully. Ron, drawing on our earlier profession, I don't care who you are and how computer savvy or computer obsessed you are. If you watch things like you're a leader / commander, go to the end of the child line rather than the beginning, you will soon get what this is all about, who to listen to and how to act. I'm really optimistic.
Toby, we've just about run it out. Do you have one more, I won't say short question capable of short answer that you want to throw out here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one last question that I thought was very interesting, and it's, what is it like to have a crisis meeting, and what is it like to hold a crisis meeting with a foreign government when something develops? If you have any experience with this.
Oh, we got lots of experience.
I can be very brief. I'll just say that when the war broke out in South Sudan, it was Christmas season, it was December 15th, and they had been going this way, but eventually the conflict blows up and the airport is closed. We want to begin evacuating non-essential staff. And I had to go in, well, I shouldn't say I had to, but I went in to ask the president to open the airport so that our planes could land. So, you know, he was already suspicious. I had had a very good reputation until the tensions started to build between the president and the vice president. And then the Americans were behind all of this stuff, even though we had been their biggest supporters. So that was obviously tense. He was in full military regalia. The other vice president had a full flak jacket on, and just to get into the presidential palace, it was, you know, sort of barricaded practically. It was surreal, but you do it. I went in, got what I needed, and the airport was opened eventually, you know, not that long after, and our planes made it in.
My experience is not so much formal meetings. The nature of the government to which we were accredited was such that everybody talked on the telephone all the time. Now, there was obviously risks to that too, because I'm sure the Russians were picking up any kind of, had most of the lines tapped into. So you had to be careful what you say. But for me and for my senior people, we had to be ready at any moment, day or night. And we had a lot of early morning, late night calls to be able to respond quickly and to try to figure out how we had a system to get an answer to a question, as opposed to us making some kind of an informal démarche over the telephone. So the telephone part was the much more difficult part rather than just formal meetings.
These kind of crises, wars, and conflicts that we're wrapped up in, we're talking about, first of all, they're human tragedies, and we can never forget that as the first thing. That said, drawing on my latest source of all lore about the Foreign Service, the Netflix series, The Diplomat, I'll be honest, this stuff is addictive. We've been preparing our whole lives to deal with this, and when we're the man or woman on the scene, all Washington and the world is watching. We're the United States, other countries, other embassies are watching. They're taking the lead from us, and it's our job to get it right. And by God, having seen dozens, if not hundreds of people in these situations, they do get it right. And we should be proud of the Foreign Service for doing it. And the benefit is the Foreign Service, seeing us get it right, keeps on sending us back in to do it again and again and again.
Yeah, my British colleague in Algiers summed that up very nicely. he said to me, Ron, if you get a reputation for being a troubleshooter, people will find more trouble for you to shoot at. It seemed to be true, but I think, Jim, to end on your last point, you know, if the United States throws its weight around too much, it can build resentment. You can get people unhappy. But if the United States does not lead, there is no one else on our side of the camp who can fill our place and take that leadership role. There may be times when you need the UN out in front or somebody else, but overall, as a matter of policy formation, if we're not in the game, it's very much it's hardly a pickup team because it's hardly a team. So I think that is a really crucial point about the centrality of this profession still. And Toby, thank you for putting this together. I think we've kind of run out of your time, but would you like, I want to thank Susan and Jim and John for bringing a smidgen of their long experience with crises to this discussion. And Maria and Katie for backing it up. Toby for thinking of it and organizing it. Toby, last words, Bill, over to you.
All right. Well, thank everyone for attending today. I really appreciate it. I would like to give a special thank you to the American Academy of Diplomacy, Ambassador Neumann, Katie, and Maria. They really helped me along the way in making this happen. They did a lot of the behind the scenes work, and there's a lot that goes into stuff like this. So I really appreciate what they've done to help me along this. And then thank you to Ambassador Jeffrey, Tefft, and Paige. I think it was a very interesting panel. It'll certainly teach me a lot of things along my path, and I think there was a lot of knowledge here today, a lot of experience, and a lot of references to The Diplomat, which I'm now going to watch. And overall, I think it was a great panel, so thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great week.
Thank you all.
Toby.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.